to this FAR Masterclass on assessing and addressing fraud risk based on earnings calls. And luckily, I see many familiar faces for this Masterclass, but also some new friends of FAR. First of all, we hope that you're personally well during these trying COVID times, and that you're managing it all. The uplift of having this opportunity to do it online, of course, is that it's easier to attend our masterclass. Also for people from abroad and for practitioners abroad. So we have an international audience today. I'm very happy with that. But to be honest, it would of course have been much more charming to have you all here in our classroom. But at least we are proud that, from a FAR perspective, that research and knowledge dissemination can continue as usual, as usual as possible at least. So I'm very happy that we have this masterclass today. And before I introduce Mark and his team, and we are very happy to have them today in our masterclass, I would like to say that I kind of lost count of the number of masterclasses that we have been doing so far. But I do know that this is the second masterclass in our second fifth-year term. Okay, that needs some explanation maybe. So you know that we've been established for initially 5 years, but we have the very good news that FAR recently had confirmed with the affiliated firms to have the second 5-year term of its existence. And I think that's very good news for research to continue and new research projects to come in, but also for knowledge dissemination on what drives audit quality, and also to evidence inform the public policy making and the public debate around audit quality in the Netherlands and internationally. So I guess that's very good news that I want to share at the start of this masterclass. So this is the second in the 5th-year term, and last month we had a masterclass, or actually a young professionals and young academics brown bag session, where our junior scholars and junior practitioners, so to say, and we oldies were not allowed to attend. Oldies, I mean, but the future generation of researchers and practitioners were able to discuss research, practical insights, and it was actually a 50-50 practitioners academic setting. So I think that's a new a new adventure in our seminars series. So today we also hope to have a lot of debate amongst practitioners and academics. But before I introduce Mark and his team, I would like to point to you that we will record this session, or we are recording this session, and that's purely so that we can share this session for those that want to watch back or could not attend. But rest assured, we will edit the recording completely in such a way that when you're put your video on or when you ask a question, you won't be recognized. So there's no reason at all to stop asking questions. You can ask all questions that you want. And if you're comfortable, I guess we all know how this works. If you're comfortable, it would be most convenient to have the cameras on so that we can see each other, especially when you want to raise a question. Please do so when you're comfortable. And during the session, when we don't talk, I would suggest to put the microphones off. So now to the good stuff. I'm very happy that Mark Peecher and his team are here today. And what can you say about such a great scholar without raising expectations even more, right? So Mark Peecher is not only a great scholar, but also the co-editor-in-chief of AOS, Accounting Organization Society, if I'm correct, and the Deloitte Chair of Accountancy. And this may be the reason why so many people from Deloitte are attending today, and that's most welcome. Maybe Mark can say a little bit more about that. So, what can you say about him, apart from being a great behavioral researcher and experimentalist? I think above all, he's simply a great teacher. I have experienced at least, and most importantly, he's simply a very nice guy. So I think that's the most important for today. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions during the sessions, and I'm sure Mark and his team will create some interaction as well. This is really your chance to learn anything you want and ask him any questions on fraud detection. And before I hand over to Mark, I also want to welcome Devin Williams and Sebastian Sternkorp, who are part of this team. Jesse Hobson is also part of the team, but he couldn't attend today. And Sebastian is actually from the Netherlands. I just wanted to raise that. Is it right, Sebastian?
I'm actually German, but I
okay. I thought already you were looking a little bit difficult there, but you were at the Erasmus University, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So and now working with Mark, and it's a great opportunity. So welcome to Mark, Devin, and Sebastian, and I give the floor to you.
Well, thank you, everyone, and it is indeed a pleasure to be here with you virtually. I really do wish that we could gather, and I look forward to the time in which we do gather as scholars and practitioners trying to understand and improve the craft of audit, the art and the science of auditing. We are also very thankful as an author team for FAR in the whole idea of coming together as scholars and practitioners, and even standard setters, regulators, and just thinking how we can improve one of the most important things really for society, even though the profession is not in the front and center of everyone's minds. We know that as trading occurs in our markets, it's only as helpful and as efficient as the information is reliable and representationally faithful. So that's one reason we do this, and we also do develop friendships and collegiality as a result of that. So we do feel very fortunate. As for the Deloitte professorship, I am honored indeed by that. It began as a fellowship, which is a 3-year renewable honor based largely on a combination of research and teaching. And so the way it works is that, of course, all of the large firms have a strong relationship historically with the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I think we have more accounting graduates probably than any other institution, although there are a couple of larger ones now that graduate more on an annual basis. Certainly more, the first PhD program in accountancy was here, and more PhD. So students graduated. So through the years, I come on to a stage which has already been set. All of the so we're building on a legacy of great thinkers. And so when Deloitte expressed an interest in wanting to know if I could, would be a fellow, I met several of, and I knew some of, because some of them were classmates when I was an undergrad here in Illinois. It was a win-win. And so what I end up doing is sharing with them on at least every 3 years, more, it's really annually, I give them sort of an update on what's happening within my research and within some of my teaching innovations. And it's really, really been fun. And it's how it also manifests in a lot of different ways, because you build on those relationships. And now we have, retired Deloitte partner here, just upstairs, who was basically 1 year ahead of me. He keeps me honest, because he's the practitioner expert. So that's the background there. And then as I continue to progress as an academic, it turns into a professorship, which is, it's a higher honor, and it's a true honor. So I am deeply appreciative of all the attendees today, but thank you for the Deloitte turnout. So let me share my slides. In the way I work is that I'll take questions really at any time. I might not see the questions immediately, and that's one reason that my colleagues Sebastian, Sterncope, and Devin are here, and then Justin just couldn't be here. So what I'm presenting today is interim work, and it's really a great workshop type of work, because I'll tell you more about what our aspirations are in this project, about the data we have collected, and about the analyses to date. But I hope that this master class, as it were, helps the three of us who are on the call, and later also Jessen, to think even more deeply about the project. I'm sure it will. So this is a title, Assessing and Addressing Fraud Risk Based on Earnings Calls. And of course, earnings calls are very helpful sources of information, and not only for fraud risk, but our particular interest here is in fraud risk. And a couple of experimental interventions focusing auditors who listen to these calls explicitly on the possibility of fraud at the client, at the auditee whose management is presenting performance information in that call, but also either separately or in addition to asking them to look for signs, to watch for signs of cognitive dissonance in the presenter. And we'll talk more about that in just a bit. So here's what I want to cover in this masterclass. Instead of diving right into our nuances of our project, I'm trying to set the table by just giving some perspectives. And I think these are pretty close to being objective perspectives on auditor fraud responsibility and how pervasive fraud is, and earnings calls as evidence, but they are of course all filtered by this author team. So if you notice something in the way I present these, or something that our slides say, even if it doesn't rise to the level of, stopping the flow of the talk, please send us the comments, because that'll help us to, make things better as we continue to work with the project. About the fourth bullet point, then I lay out the theory that we use to guide our field experiment, lay out the predictions, and then I describe in pretty broad brushstrokes the nature of our field experiment. And then I'm happy to present some preliminary findings based on a combination of what normally would be thought of as experimental data, but also some I have never seen. We feel very fortunate in this regard, archival control variables that pertain to the participants and the auditees, the audit clients, whose earnings calls were being listened to. And then also I want to share with you some of the journey ahead. So that's the outline of the talk. So there was a point in time when really a different form of ownership structure was dominant, where the objectives of an ordinary financial statement audit, really one of the lead objectives, was the detection of fraud. But the audit profession, within which I would guess everyone who's on the call today has grown up and had been educated in and participated in or studied, that has not been the case. The appetite for being responsible for fraud detection substantially dropped with the worldwide depression in the early 30s, 1930s. And what mindset later came, and this is kind of a busy slide, but this is auditing standards in the United States circa 1960. Let me highlight a few things here, is that the ordinary examination, I won't read the whole thing to you, cannot be relied upon to disclose really. I didn't highlight defalcations. That's really embezzlements, employee theft most of the time. But then you get to irregularities, which would include financial statement fraud. And there's a lot of reasons and conjectures about why the profession didn't say fraud right here. One of which is that fraud has a particular legal definition, and in different jurisdictions, there are usually 4 or 5 different elements that one needs to prove fraud, including something which is often the most difficult part, malicious intent on the part of the person committing fraud. So they are discussing deliberate misrepresentation, and I put usually here because I view this as a bit of a what in the United States we might call a waffle word. What we mean by that, it's a soft word. It's giving auditors latitude, flexibility. So they're trying to say that an ordinary audit, as opposed to a fraud audit, cannot be relied upon to assure its discovery. And then we could, of course, dive into what does assure mean. Is that reasonable assurance, which I think it is, as opposed to absolute assurance. And then what they really put in here is quite interesting, is that the responsibility of the independent auditor to detect fraud arises only, and see, that's an interesting modifier, only, when such failure clearly results. So this is a very interesting and unambiguously results from non-compliance with generally accepted audit standards. And that's a perspective. In the mid to late 1990s, going back to the early 1900s, this was the first time that auditors in the United States, and I think there's probably parallel developments. Maybe one thing that Olaf and others can help me understand is what really was the prevailing standards in the Netherlands during these different points in time. We can, as an author team, easily identify when the IAASB audit standards first came into the picture. But auditors are, for the first time in '97, responsible for explicitly, first considering fraud risk factors, but then explicitly and separately assessing the risk of material misstatement due to fraud. So this was the first time in a long time that in the working papers, auditors had to document their assessment of the risk of material misstatement due to fraud. And the particulars here is that the auditors still were not responsible for detecting fraud. It sounds a little pedantic probably, but they were really responsible for detecting material misstatement due to fraud. And those two are a bit different. The primary responsibility lies with detecting material misstatements in the financial statements due to fraud. But then they had to explicitly also address this risk of material misstatement due to fraud based on their assessment. So for the first time, auditors had a lot of strategic thinking to engage in with respect to, well, what do I want to put in the working papers, not only to show high quality auditing, but also to justify my professional judgment. Because on the one hand, it looks bad if we assess fraud risk to be high and elevated, because we're asking one another, why is it clear that this is the type of client that we really want to be associated with our firm, as an example. But it's also worrisome if you assess the risk of fraud, material misstatement due to fraud, to be quite low, and there later turns out to be fraud. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of centrality bias. There's a lot of incentive to sort of just say this is the average audit. It's not clear what the incentives are to assess fraud, particularly low or high. And it's also interesting you had to address fraud. And that actually became even more apparent in the standards that really continue to prevail today in both the AICPA in the United States for private companies, PCAOB in the United States, and the IAASB. They all recognize that auditors are responsible for providing, and I could have emphasized this because reasonable assurance has been clarified as high assurance that no material misstatement exists, whether due to error or fraud. And what has changed since the mid-1990s is that auditors are now required to do something which is actually psychologically, I would say, nearly impossible, to set aside any belief, no matter how well formed and foundational that belief is rooted in evidence, that management is honest. I mean, you could have experienced an ongoing, over a decade-long relationship with management, and maybe you've observed firsthand multiple times in which management could have egregiously managed earnings, but maybe because you brought it to their attention as an audit team, and then you see management say, we're going to do the right thing, we're going to be representationally faithful in our earnings. You can observe that repeatedly, and that the audit standards say you got to set that aside. Well, that is not only almost psychologically impossible, from a Bayesian normative belief revision perspective, that is antithetical to normative behavior. So I don't know what the standard setters were thinking of here when they wrote this into the standards. Now there's some backpedaling that you see in the IAASB standards. They have footnotes now saying, of course, it's impossible to do this, which is even more hilarious to me. So that's my little editorial on standards. But the pressure on auditors to detect fraud and address the risk of material misstatement due to fraud it's on another uptick. And this time, instead of a lot of the, in the late 1990s, where multiple firms had alleged audit failures, but Arthur Andersen, at one time one of the gold standard audit firms, they had a spate of alleged frauds, and some of the most egregious and well-known, such as Enron and WorldCom, Tyco, Global Crossing, and the list goes on and on. But we see things, and it's not a secret that E&Y in particular, with all respect to the E&Y professionals who may be on the call, you know that you've been particularly in the news, and Wirecard is one reason, but that's not the only reason. And it's hard to say you're not in the news when you're on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. There was an article talking about a series of alleged frauds. And I think all the other professionals in the room are probably feeling like they're, but for the grace of God, go I. I mean, because fraud is hard to detect. In management who commits fraud, they are also interested in concealing it. So that's the background on auditors' responsibility for fraud. We can't duck it. So how big of a deal is this purposeful, malicious, if you will, misrepresentation in financial statements? Okay, so I have here an iceberg, and the real question is, how much of the iceberg is below the surface of the water? And even though we can't see the iceberg perfectly with our technology, what can academics do to help the profession right-size their assessments of the risk of fraud? Even in an audit textbook that's probably less than 12 years old, it was an unusual audit textbook written by Bill Kinney and Roger Martin. It was an audit textbook designed for corporate governance professionals and managers, not for preparers of audits, not for people who actually do audits. Every other audit textbook is for people who are going to go into the profession. This was rather trying to make the case for managers, and it was something that was used at Kellogg at Northwestern for a while, for people to understand why we do fraud. And one of the estimates of fraud in that book was in the vicinity of, 0.5% to 1%. And I think they also went on to elaborate that those could be quite a bit lower than the real incidence rate. So what does the latest academic research suggest? And I think that the practitioners in the room may have a very different view, and they might think that these numbers are too high. And gosh, we would be very interested in that if it's the case, either today during the call, the Masterclass, but also just if you would correspond with Devin, Sebastian, myself, or Jessen, or maybe even reach out to Olaf, who in turn can get it to us. So one very intriguing, go ahead. So I'll start this off with a poll question, as a matter of fact. I think this would be interesting to look at. What percentage of large public corporations engage in financial statement fraud at any given point in time? So I think, Olaf, is it the case that they have a chance to respond to this?
Yes, I've just sent a link in the chat for this meeting that people can click on, and then they can fill in the poll.
Great. So I'll pause here and see what kind of responses we get, and then maybe Devin can summarize the responses.
I have 20 responses now, so I'm just going to forward this to Devin.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, I'm as excited as everybody to see what everyone put here. So, should I share my screen to show the results, or just read them, Mark?
Oh, go ahead and share your screen. That'd be fine.
Okay, great. Are you seeing the responses now?
Yes.
Okay, great. As you can see here, we're a fairly split group. Lots of all over the place, right? So we have, I think, by just a small margin, the majority thinks it's not very many, fewer than 5% of firms. And then, as you can see, we are similar. So everybody thinks at least 15% or fewer firms are engaged in fraud at any given moment, but there's a few that think it's higher than that.
Excellent. So I think that hopefully my screen is shared again. So I don't have a definitive answer for you. I have estimates based on research. So Andrew Dyke, Adair Morris, and Luigi Zingales, Toronto, currently at Berkeley, and Luigi's a professor of finance at the Chicago Booth School. Adair was at Chicago with Luigi at the time. And one estimate was, for some of you, it's pretty high. It's shockingly high, perhaps. It was 14.5% of all large U.S. public corporations engage in fraud at any point in time. And I could explain a lot more about the methodology here, but the essence of it was that 4%, if you looked at SEC enforcement actions, which is really not just detected fraud, it's an important thing. It's the detected fraud plus those that seem to be either egregious or serious enough, or that they thought as a regulator they wanted to bring before the public and illustrate that this is not acceptable. Maybe they thought it was a case that they could also win. So the 4% already sort of understates how much fraud was actually caught, perhaps. But if that's the case, and if you keep that in mind and look at the increase in the rate at which all of the audit firms, besides Arthur Andersen, look at the rate at which they detect fraudulent financial reporting in their new clients that they now inherit as a result of Andersen's demise. And then the authors make an interesting assumption that the auditors, when they get these new clients, are really very careful in their audit examinations. The term they used was cleaning house. such that the probability of, if there is fraud on those new engagements, the probability of it being caught is 100%, which seems heroic. It seems too high. By the way, though, if this were assumed to be 80%, the effect of that is that this number would be higher. What they found is that the rate at which auditors detected fraud on old Arthur Andersen clients was 4 times the rate of the typical rate for all of the auditors historically. And with that as a background, and the 4%, they basically divided this 4% by 27.5% to come up with 14.5. And we had this paper presented at a University of Illinois auditing symposium, which is the same symposium that Olaf has presented at much more recently with co-authors. And we had a very outstanding discussant, Joe Weber from MIT, come and discuss the paper. And he did a great job discussing it, as you can imagine, but he pointed out reasons that this could be smaller, but he also pointed out reasons why this could be an underestimate. We also had one of the leading partners from KPMG, the firm with the strongest roots in the Netherlands, of course, come, and he was a bit more skeptical of the possibility of it being this high, but he also conceded that, we're not really sure why this would be necessarily too high. So what else did the authors do to validate this as being at least a reasonable estimate of the base rate of fraud? By the way, one thing I need to mention is that probably only 1/2 of the frauds that they looked at in that particular sample were really financial statement frauds, clearly financial statement frauds. They're frauds that dealt with things within an annual report or a registration statement, but were they within the financial statements or the notes thereto all the time? No, not yet. But of course, that's a little bit disingenuous too, because anytime you have, let's just say, let's talk about VW, for example, Falve, right? The case there where they were they had used their computer software to show that, to basically misrepresent the emissions that were illegal to have, especially in the state of California in the United States, when these vehicles would be under the inspection process. But as soon as the vehicles would leave the mechanic and get out on the road again, their emissions levels were much higher and in fact above where it could be for compliance. Well, one could argue that that's not really something that you need to put in the financial statements. But of course, if that is detected, as it subsequently was, there should be a liability that's accrued in the financial statements, or at least disclosed. So where is it that a fraud is not a financial statement fraud is a little bit trickier than first meets the eye. If it's something that management is engaging in operationally and it's found out, whether it's a Ford Pinto gas tanks that have a fire hazard going back many years, or the VW fraud much more recently, clearly there's a huge legal penalties here. So you've probably had time to read this slide about what happened at a completely different approach, where the author team surveyed Booth in
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
Mark, Olaf's got a question.
Oh, yes. I also wanted to test whether raising my hand, and also for the other participants, if they want to ask a question.
Yeah, anytime.
Just raise your hand and the team will pick up. But I have a serious question as well. And you already touched upon this, Mark, and that is on the area of, what is our academic view on the distinction between a true fraud on the one hand and what could be seen as, an intentional error.
Yeah.
And maybe intentional error is in between there. You touched upon it already a bit, but and I'm sure the practitioners will know what the standards say. But how do we distinguish from a research perspective between these two? When is it really a real fraud, and when do we see it as that's simply an error?
That's a great question. And I think one of the most innocent, if you will, reasons that the profession has been reluctant to say we're responsible for detecting material misstatement due to fraud is that one perspective is that fraud is itself a legal construct. a legal concept that the determination of whether fraud exists or not is best made by attorneys, or by, if it goes to a jury trial or a judge trial, either by juries or a judge. An excellent paper on this matter was written by one of my former colleagues at the University of Washington. He has other co-authors on this, but his name is Jonathan Karpov. I can definitely share the link. But it provides in there, and in fact, I just shared this with a quite experienced lawyer in New York. It's a paper that talks about fraud from 3 different perspectives: from the legal perspective, from a finance perspective, and from an accounting perspective. And although the constructs overlap, they are not identical. The auditors with whom we talk, it's hard to, one of the hardest things to audit is intent, right? So,
yes.
And we don't even have a good set of standards for, say, how do you discern intent versus a lack of intent? That's where a lot right now of professional judgment is being used.
Okay, that may solve a lot, professional judgment, I guess.
I think that's one reason that the next paper I talk about here on the next slide is
Yes, please. Thank you.
Is by Karpov. I'm not familiar with Abdullah or Martin, but I know as an assistant professor, my office was right across the hallway from Jonathan Karpov, and Jennifer Koski was right down the hall in Seattle, Washington, at the University of Washington. So I wanted to give you a more recent, so that was a 2013 estimate, and it's not so much an estimate technically of fraud. What they use is a different term. They say SEC actionable. In other words, not immaterial or material. These are things that matter. Okay, so not trivial or not immaterial. So SEC, of course, is the Securities Exchange Commission, the regulator with power in the United States to sanction financial misrepresentation. So they talk about this as being intentional misrepresentation. And what they come up with is an even higher estimate of 22.3%. And they basically use an approach that would be, by today's standards, low-tech machine learning. But it is a long-use standard methodology for predicting whether whether something belongs in category X or category Y. And so what they do, they use a combination of all of the caught firm years. In a firm year, I mean, academics know exactly what this is, but the practitioners, this is, if you have a client for 10 years, that is 10 firm years. And so in the United States, a little bigger market, over a period of multiple decades, there's nearly 400,000 firm years, and only 100,000 firm years were caught and subjected to enforcement either by class action or Securities Act. This is DOJ, this is Department of Justice, and they looked for one particular legal citation, which is getting into the weeds here a little bit, Section 13B, but this is basically this is really about financial statement misrepresentation. So unlike prior estimate, in which more of the frauds were at least initially not financial statement fraud, we're talking about financial statement fraud here. So how they did this real quickly is that they fit a logistic regression. So it just fits this log form. And basically firms are either, in fact, the firms are one of 2 types. Even though financial statement misstatement actually continuously probably runs the gamut between honest mistake, technical error, maybe a little bit of acceptable earnings management or real earnings management, and then maybe some window dressing, then egregious earnings management, and then misrepresentation, but maybe not really trying to hurt shareholders. Maybe you're trying to do this to help shareholders because you truly believe that things would turn around, right? Rationalization to out and out fraud. There are 2 events here in this model, and they'll either go, at the top or the bottom here. You'd either have firms that are fraud or are not, and down here you have a vector, if you will, a bunch of prediction variables that will put each firm year somewhere on this x-axis, and then the model that explains transforms that variable. It'll transform the firms somewhere on this logistic function. So if a firm were on this logistic function between 0 and 0.5, when you summed up all these predictor variables, and the predictor variables might be things like how did the gross margin change year over year? How did sales growth change year over year? What was something called the F score year over year? Were there any modifications to the auditor opinion? So there's, probably 40 or so, probably more than that, predictor variables that they looked at. So if you had a score of 0.25, what this model does is tells you it estimates the probability that it is a fraud firm, which would be these ones versus these zeros, and it would be probability 0.6. Whereas if the sum of all those predictive variables came to 1, then you have a very high likelihood of being a fraud. So what they do, they don't find fraud in all of their cases of predicted fraud, but what they do instead, they use this form of machine learning that divides the world into fraud firms and non-fraud firms based on all these predictive variables, as well as the violator firms that have been caught. And so what they end up doing in this is they say, what firm years look the most like these violator years? What model would do a really good job of predicting these violators, but also would tell the regulators that here are other firms that probably are just as bad, if not worse, than what you've caught. And so they use this. You can divide the world into what the SEC or what think of the regulators that you associate with, maybe a European Union financial statement authority. So you find firms that they say, we have found fraud here, and that would be all of their observed positives. And here's all the firms for whom there has been no action, and they therefore, silence is a good thing in that regard. And so this would be the observed negatives. And they compare that to what their model predicts. And they think they fit, the Logit model uses a sort of a maximum likelihood estimation approach to try to perform as well as it can in terms of having true positives and true negatives. So let me show you the real data as it turned out here. So here's the firms that the SEC or Department of Justice firm years said involved fraud. And they had, their model successfully classifies, most of those. 1,405 of the 2,339, their model also suggests as fraud. The more interesting fact is that their model not only suggests that this 1,405 firms were engaging in fraud, but that they also the regulators are missing a lot of other fraudsters. So they estimate with their best model that they can come up with is that 39,889 firm years divided by the total number of firm years that are available for their test. And this is lower than the 400,000 I said earlier. I think there are data limitations on their predictor variables, but that comes out to 22.3%. And so that how good is their model? Well, I don't know the exact answer to that, but I'm showing you what I think of as the best of the academic research that is out there predicts. And this paper was recently presented at a joint conference of this was the JAR, I think this was the JAR conference with the PCAOB. It may have been, the PCAOB has had historically it may have become an accounting review conference. It did become an accounting review conference with Robert Neckel leading it, but the PCAOB has a couple of academic conferences. One is with the American Accounting Association. One has historically been with JAR. They had switched over to the accounting review. This paper was presented very recently at one of those. And it was thoughtfully discussed. But so you have no clear answer, but I think the data and the models that are existing point to a little bit higher number of fraud many of you would have guessed. And of course, you might be right, and the model might be wrong. So the next thing I want to talk about in terms of background, and then we'll get into the actual specifics of the study, is just earnings calls as audit evidence. You know, we're not looking at earnings calls because we think that's necessarily the best evidence auditors come into contact with in the engagement, but we think it's just something we can access publicly, but it is evidence that has been shown to matter. Audit standards differ in the extent to which they mention specifically these earnings calls. I can't find anywhere in the IAASB current standards that says, you know, we really want auditors and recommend auditors, or at least higher up members of the audit team, to be listening to these calls. But there is very clearly an emphasis on the output of analysts, which is their reports. And analysts get a lot of their information from these earnings calls. And analysts ask sometimes softball, easy questions, but sometimes probing and hard questions of management. And sometimes management gets these questions in advance, I understand. It's a bit of a gimmick. But other times management gets hard questions that are not rehearsed and not planned. And so this is a really ripe area to look at. So the PCAOB standards currently recommends use of earnings calls, goes a little bit further than I think than the IAASB standards. But what does the research say? Is this a good idea? The research out there says, yeah, this is really a great idea because earnings calls contain incremental information content. And we're not talking about just fraud here. I mean, there's a lot of reasons you you should listen to earnings calls, I believe, as an audit professional, or at least have particular members on your engagement team listen to these calls, because it can help you plan an audit just from a perspective of there could be errors in the financial statements, or it might help you identify significant accounts. There's a lot of reasons, but fraud is also one of them. So this last slide here, there's been different techniques used, such as looking at what words are being said, how positive, how extreme are the words, how often we're using I, we versus our, these types of things. There's also simply using voice software technology. So just the frequency at which my voice is, if it's high or if it's low, or if I slow down my cadence, these things can be correlates of cognitive dissonance, which in turn is a correlate of deception. Yet detecting deception is actually very hard. We think as humans maybe that we are better at this than we actually are. I've seen a number of videos where people claim to be very capable of detecting when even close friends or spouses are lying. It may not be so easy, but there is some empirical evidence in experiments, prior work that Jessen and I have done. And this is kind of getting really close to the roots of the paper here today, where we actually asked auditors with an average of over 20 years of experience. Almost all of these were partners or very recently retired partners. It was an experiment that lasted the better part of 2 hours because they listened to excerpts of 4 earnings calls. And the intent here was that, you know, we weren't trying to have them match up with their own client, which is very different than what our current design is. And in some cases, that may have happened just due to chance, in which case we set those aside. But what we found is that, and we had a base rate of fraud in our experimental sample here of 50%, which is, even if the earlier estimates are true, is probably at least twice the normal rate. And we told the participants that. We said that, hey, you're listening to a random sample out of a small subset of firms, and half of these firms had fraud or something like fraud, alleged fraud occurring during this conference call, and half did not. Or really what we meant by that is half had no detected fraud occurring. So what we found is that the audit partners, it just seemed unlikely to us that very experienced audit professionals would lack the know-how, would lack the knowledge or the skill to find deception in management. This is what we think actually the seasoned audit professional is one of the most valuable persons to society, precisely because he or she has this knowledge, has the skill. The question we had in our mind is what will it take to unlock that knowledge? What will it take to let auditors bring that knowledge and skill to bear? Because we believe, and we'll get into it more in the theory, that it's not very fun, not very pleasant to think about your clients committing fraud. So what we found is that if you just simply asked these seasoned audit professionals to watch for cognitive dissonance in the earnings call presenters, that suddenly they were much more better than chance at detecting deceptions without reducing their accuracy on significantly on the non-fraud firms. I mean, one way you could catch all of the fraud firms is just to say fraud every time. No, that's not what was going on here. They were still equally discriminating of, if you will, truthful firms, and at the same time increasing the discrimination on fraudulent firms. So the next poll question here is, what percentage of auditors, and I think I have a couple of poll questions here coming up somewhat simultaneously, or sequentially, I should say. So let's do this one. What percentage of auditors would you say regularly listen to clients' earnings calls?
And Mark, while we're taking that poll question, there's been a question in the chat box. If you can see that, maybe you could speak to it while we all take the poll.
Yeah, I'll quit sharing my screen and do that for sure. Let's see. Hopefully we can keep this this chat, because these questions here are going to be very helpful. Let's see here.
Yes, Mark, all questions in the chat will be available to you.
Right. So I see a number of questions here. It would be interesting to know whether the practitioners are building their own models. I would if it's my firm. Boy, that's a really good question by Remco Rennes. I'm maybe not pronouncing the name correctly. What can we learn from this research? I'll take the excellent on non-ethical behavior impacting integrity instead of only financial statement errors. And how can we improve integrity? That is actually an excellent question. I would need to think about it a little bit more. There is a really cool JFE, Journal of Financial Economics paper that basically looks at whether behaviors like violating community standards, being repeat offenders in speeding tickets or other things like this, or I'm being unfaithful in a marriage, like someone makes a public vow to be faithful. What if they cheat on their partner? These things, these other integrity lapses are actually correlated with financial statement fraud and corporate malfeasance. So there's not this separate box. You can't compartmentalize, apparently, or at least some people can't compartmentalize their lives to integrity failures in general and integrity failures when it comes to financial reporting. So that we can probably get that paper citation out to the audience later, but that was a fabulous paper. What's the results here?
Let's see, we're close to getting them.
Okay. I'm gonna warm up my coffee then.
All right, perfect. Here, what percent typically listen to clients' earnings calls? And so a substantial portion of us think it's 20% or thereabouts or less actually listen to the client's earnings calls, which is important for our study on if they actually use this, because as Mark said, standard setters certainly think there's information there. Analysts obviously know there's information there. The next most common response was 40, and then as you can see, it declines from there.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for that. So based on the respondents in our current study, It varies, where very experienced members of the audit team have figured out either it's part of the firm culture, or they have self-selected into figuring out that this is something that they need to do. So partners, basically 2/3 of partners, anyone from manager on, 2 in every 3 roughly are listening to these calls. And it doesn't mean necessarily that they're listening to them live, but they are listening to them. And that's very encouraging to us, because we assume that when that occurs, the main information content for the audit hopefully is in turn shared with lower ranked members of the audit team. Now that's of course a risk, because one of the things I've shown in some of my other work is that people who are like managers and partners, they unfortunately project their own mental model of what they know about the client onto lower ranked members of the audit team. They start assuming that what they know is shared by lower ranked members of the audit team. So this may be a bit risky of a step function here, where, you know, even experienced seniors, 1 in 3, this sounds a little bit worrisome to me, because as we know in the leverage model in firms, a lot of the frontline audit testing work is organized by experienced seniors and carried out by experienced seniors. After listening to an earnings conference call, roughly what percentage of auditors on an engagement team will plan to revise their audit plan in any significant way? And then maybe, I don't know if we'll do these 2 questions separately. If we can, it would be great. But just to know, how would your response to poll question 1, it should say poll question 3A, differ by auditor rank? So here's what I want you to look at now. After listening to an earnings conference call, roughly what percentage of auditors on an engagement team will plan to revise? Okay, we heard something, we have to do something different now. And does that differ by rank?
Okay, we now have some results to look at.
Great.
So we'll do that. So what we see here is we're pretty evenly split here in terms of thinking how many are actually going to change the audit in any significant way after listening to a conference call. As you can see, the numbers are almost exactly uniformly distributed among the responses. In the next poll, however, by rank, you know, about half think, I'm trying to remember what that one was. So it increases as the rank increases from staff to, and I can't see the end of that one.
It's just strictly increasing from staff to senior, senior to manager, manager partner.
That's what I thought. Yeah. So that they think, you know, the higher up, the more you're going to change it. So we're pretty split on that first question, but the second question, there's a majority here. And then the second highest answer was down here, highest for staff and partners and lower for kind of the mid-tier workers.
Excellent. Thank you. So let's carry on here. What, and your answers may be better than these data, because these data are, you know, they are not 100% truth, right? But this is what auditors, who we believe had no reason to, you know, say anything but the truth, this is what they said. After listening to this call, do you plan to revise the audit plan in any way? And it's pretty monotone, it's pretty increasing across rank here. With the smallest changes, you know, staff may be reticent to change a plan no matter what, because they're just learning. But this is actually a little different finding than you might have guessed from prior research, because prior research suggests that it's the early staff who mistakenly tend to see fraud on almost every engagement, or they're having a hard time believing, maybe coming to grips with the notion of materiality. So that needs to be something that's socialized with them. This is a little grainier. We did have 2 kinds of respondents in our study. One set of respondents, and by far the largest number, are members of the audit team listening to an earnings call for their own client, their own audit client. But then we also had a set of control participants, predominantly also partners. And if any of you in the room have participated in these things, we are very thankful for that participation. And what we found is that the propensity to say some things need to change in the audit plan is markedly higher among the control participants than the engagement specific participants. And what I want you to be thinking of is why might that be? And what are the likely reasons for that? And we have two very different plausible, and there's a lot of varieties of these, but two very different plausible possibilities here. One is that the control partners, even though they've been in the profession absolutely as long as the engagement partners, they just don't know the extent to which the engagement partners have already responded to these cues that the control partners and senior managers are now more worried about after listening to the call. This is kind of the good news version. The bad news, and something that is also very psychologically plausible, and if not more probable with all respect, is that there's just a reticence, a rationalization that may occur for people who are on an audit team to even contemplate that management with whom they have interacted over the years, multiple years perhaps, are now committing fraud or engaging in financial statement misrepresentation. We know from prior psychology literature that that is something that is very likely to occur, and it could be that both of these are occurring. They're not mutually exclusive. So this one here, we really don't need to take the time to get the full answer. This is literally just a setup question. So I think for the sake of time, we'll just kind of ask it and go on. But after listening to an earnings call, if an auditor believes that the risk of material misstatement is higher than previously believed, what implications, if any, should this have for planned substantive evidence? Answer A, planned substantive evidence should increase, planned substantive evidence should decrease, no change is implied or implicated, or none of the above, and very clearly, planned substantive evidence should increase. And it's this behavior that we are beginning to really look at closely within our experiment. To what extent do auditors who actually think there is an increase in risk of material misstatement, and particularly due to fraud, what do they do? Does that cohere? Does that change in their risk assessment then cohere into them developing plans to probe that possibility, to examine that possibility? So the theory in our paper is that auditors, like other humans, have an intense aversion to thinking of close others, socially close others, to engage in bad behaviors. It's not pleasant to think about one's partner or spouse or parents or children or close business associates to be engaged in behavior that is unethical, lacks integrity, that is fraudulent. And we know that if there is that aversion, psychologically, people respond to these aversive events by, one, they substitute their preference for there being no fraud. They use that to inform their belief. Their preferences are informing their beliefs, not the evidence. You see, that's a motivated reasoning story where people confuse their beliefs and their preferences. Even more extreme version of that is that when there are mildly diagnostic signals of bad behavior, that instead of being objective and saying, I guess that it's possible that in my case, my wife is cheating on me and having had an affair, instead of me thinking that if there were an objective signal that made that more likely, there's a possibility of what's called reactance. And reactance basically means that I am now, because I explained this away, I am now even more confident in my belief that there is no bad behavior here, that there is no fraud here. So there's a very strong possibility from reactance and motivated reasoning story that if you are on the engagement and someone with whom you've worked over the years is engaging in fraud, you would, because of psychological factors, either not increase your assessment of the risk of fraud, or actually you could talk yourself into believing that the risk of fraud is lower than you did before. Okay, another response is that if you have to be in compliance with audit standards and you want to look good, you'll just increase the assessed risk of fraud, but that's just something you document on paper for compliance and you don't truly believe it. And if you don't truly believe it, you probably will not follow up on that to the same extent on your audit tests, which could cause a fundamental disconnect between what you assess as the risk of fraud and what you do. So we really look at that. We really look at that coherence between what you assess and what you say you will do as that coherence, that association, as a strong test of our theory. Well, what does this aversive set of psychological reactions do? Well, it blocks the access that is critical to fraud detection from being appropriated, from being accessed to its fullest extent. And we see this in the earlier paper that I spoke of, even for audit partners that are not working on their own engagements. If we did not ask them to look beyond the lookout for cognitive dissonance, they were actually no better than chance. And in fact, they actually performed descriptively below 50-50, below chance, just not statistically below chance. But once you ask them to look for signs of cognitive dissonance, instead of saying, watch for fraud, which is that aversive event, they perform much better. So that's what we're looking at in the study. If you're going to get large percentages of engagement teams listening to earnings calls, what should be the focus? We think there's a danger. You know, everyone sort of thought that the SAS 82, hey, watch for fraud. This is what auditors should be doing. And that is true. But once you think about the psychological nature of human beings, if you're asking people to watch for aversive events, they may not be thinking that these events are any more likely, and they may be less likely to respond to those events. And we think that if you do something that's less threatening, and it's also something in the motivated reasoning literature would be labeled as something that breaks down reasonable constraints, because even though we want to use our preferences to inform our beliefs, we are also, as humans, we want to think of ourselves as rational. And so if the evidence is sufficiently strong, and this is when it would violate reasonable constraints, if the way we're thinking here is that if we ask you to look for cognitive dissonance as an auditor, that's not as threatening to you. There could be a lot of reasons that, after all, that management has cognitive dissonance. You know, in high pressure performance times, you may exhibit dissonance. You may really want and believe that there will be no problems, with our supply chains when we're trying to get vaccines out for COVID, or no problems in the likelihood of our products being returned. It's not that you're necessarily committing fraud, but once you get auditors looking for dissonance, then the next step is, well, dissonance is a positive correlate or positive predictor of deception. And so those two together make it unreasonable, even within these highly motivated reasoning type, reactance type things occurring, that undoes that bind and makes them reason more objectively, is what we're thinking would occur here. But if you prompt them to look for fraud, keep turning up the volume on that aversive event, the benefits of cognitive dissonance are going to go away. So we think that this is especially going to be the case when you're on the engagement team. So what do we do? So we're very fortunate here because archival and experimental studies typically are occurring in these parallel universes, and we have the good fortune here with the cooperation of the firm's amazing cooperation and the help of FAR professionals to actually, instead of doing simply archivally informed experimental work, we do both kind of simultaneously here. So we're doing a field experiment to test whether fraud prompts instigate an aversive reaction or motivated reasoning, and whether cognitive dissonance prompts, help unlock auditors' fraud detection know-how. And the latter is unless accompanied by a fraud prompt. The fraud prompt could be the yeast that spoils the dough in this case, right? Not the yeast that makes the dough rise. We're worried about direct looking for frauds, cognitive dissonance to be better. And then we use archival controls and supplemental archival data as controls and as some cool supplemental DVs. And actually, we're going to use them. I'll show you in our journey ahead as some IVs as well. So at the auditors, so my awesome set of co-authors and actually doctoral students, because there are a lot of earnings calls that have been that were done. So not all of the auditors, as you can imagine, could listen to these in real time. So we had to basically memorialize these calls and then arrange for auditors to listen to these calls in many cases. And we controlled for things like, had they listened to the call already? We also controlled for, is this really your client and such? But there's a series of questions that we asked them. We asked them, how much risk did you think exists on this client before you start the call of material misstatement? So where are you at before you engage in listening to this call? And then as you listen to the call, in real time, you can jot down things that are worrisome to you, or things that might make you want to ask a new question as an auditor. Or maybe we'd ask about, like, were there some questions that you really wanted the analyst to ask that didn't? So lots of things like this to get the juices, the thoughts going. So we predict that a fraud prompt will result in no improvement to, or an actual weakening of the coherence, which we measure by the just the linear correlation, like a correlation, the association between assessed versus addressed risk of material misstatement due to fraud. So auditing basics, when you assess the risk of fraud to be higher, you need to do more with respect to the nature, timing, and extent of your audit procedures, control and substantive, to address that fraud risk. And we also predict, which we have not yet executed this test, but I'll tell you about how we plan to, and I'd be interested in your suggestions for number 2 here. We predict that there will be no improvement or even reduced differentiation between objectively higher versus lower fraud risk auditees. So we think we can take advantage of a methodology similar to what we saw in the Karpov paper with the logistic regression, and look at, we don't have all the same variables that they do, but we have a number of variables that they do not have, and some variables that they do. And we can separate the universe of the audit clients into higher and lower fraud risk auditees. And we haven't done this yet, and we plan to. So that's coherence. Yes.
Mark?
Yes.
Mark, I just wanted to give you the 15-minute mark towards the end. So
Yeah.
maybe you want to discuss some questions with the audience, or the audience want to
Sure.
ask some questions. So
Absolutely. So
I'll leave it up to you how to
thank you.
use that.
Just a couple of result slides and then we're really done. And I'll
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So unlike the fraud prompt, we think the cognitive dissonance prompt will result in a strengthened association between assessed and addressed risk due to fraud, and improved differentiation between objectively higher versus lower fraud risk auditees. And another prediction is auditors who are not on the engagement team are just generally going to be more open to assessing heightened risk of fraud and more willing to address the heightened risk of fraud. Why is that? And I've talked about that. It's less aversive for them. And this actually is very helpful in the audit, because it may be that the institutional-wide practice of consulting, informally even, with other auditors might be something that is a really cool quality control that we're not capturing as well as we could maybe in the study, but it can be very helpful. So here's the actual prompt for fraud. Let's let you look at that real quick. due to fraud. And earnings manipulation or fraud. The cognitive dissonance prompt specifically pay attention to markers or signals that could indicate client management is experiencing cognitive dissonance. Then we define it. It's the negative, uncomfortable emotion a person feels when they say something that they know is not true, and they can feel uneasy or bothered. So 184 participants plus 23 control. It's not of those 184, 23 are control. You have 184 in engagement-oriented participants, 23 control. Pre-call assessment, listen to the call, post-call assessments, and then archival supplemental DVs. So what we do here is that we do something called a factor score, where we basically look at, and I know academics get this already, but there are several questions that the answers to which really correlate one with another. So we basically combine using statistics, and we weight the responses to 3 questions for their fraud risk assessments. And it's the response to what is your new and revised assessment of the overall risk of material misstatement at the client? What is the risk that earnings manipulation or fraud is occurring at the client, these Likert scales, and then provide an overall judgment of whether it is more likely than not that earnings manipulation or fraud is elevated. So these 3 questions are highly correlated, and they form one unitary factor that we call fraud risk assessment. Similarly, we have fraud risk addressment. To what degree, if any, would you change the nature of your test in terms of plan persuasiveness? To what degree would you change the extent? And after listening to this call, do you plan to revise the audit in any particular way? So just some descriptives here. So these scales there are people with a lot of centrality bias, and about 44% answered question 18 is yes, and 41% answered question 17 is yes, which means slightly under half say that there's an increase in assessed risk or a need to address the risk. Some of the main controls here, and the control participant, whether they've heard the call in the past and whether you're a partner or not listening to the call. And I'll skip these for now, but we'll use these later to try to sort out companies that were objectively higher or lower fraud risks. So here's what we find in terms of the coherence of assessed and addressed risk of material misstatement due to fraud. What we find is that, as predicted in a univariate sense, not any control variables here, that these two are most strongly correlated. This would be considered a strong correlation by a lot of, correlation runs from 0 to 1, and it can be positive or negative, whereas this type of correlation would be considered weak. This is encroaching on what might be called potentially moderate, but the point is you see the peak here. And that's also the case for both partners and non-partners. But if anything, and this is what's really striking, it's more strong of a pattern for partners. Look at what happens to the attenuation of the benefits of the cognitive dissonance prompt for increasing the correlation between assessed and addressed risk. If you're a partner, it's actually helping, but what will kill that, and this looks very much like an aversive reaction to me, it goes away in its entirety. And what makes me think it's an aversive reaction in particular is that you don't see that for non-partners. And who is it on the engagement team that has the socially closest relationship with the client? Well, it's the partner. So I think this is a striking univariate evidence of the story we were trying to tell. Multivariate.
Mark, can we pause for just a second? There's some chat questions that I think it's a great time to address them now. And it's kind of just, can you explain just in more simple language what cognitive dissonance is, versus fraud? Is cognitive dissonance just a different way of saying fraud, or kind of what are the differences in more simple?
So dissonance is a symptom of negative and mixed emotions, affective responses in a human. It can occur for reasons besides lying. It could easily occur, for example, this cognitive dissonance can occur if you're just saying something that you're not sure will occur or not sure that has occurred. It's a negative, ambivalent feeling, and it's a heightened sense of arousal. And so what's really interesting about cognitive dissonance too is that younger adults have a very difficult time, according to the literature, spotting it. But people who are in their mid-40s, which is not me anymore because I'm well into my 50s, they can spot that when someone's engaging in cognitive dissonance. You can spot that. So they start, they illustrate a number of behaviors. So this dissonance idea is basically, it's asking the engagement team, do you think that that presenter is experiencing unpleasant arousal or unpleasant negative emotions? And then the point is that one source of those could be this fraud that could be occurring, but there's a lot of reasons it could be occurring. I mean, they could be doing a call right when they, heard about the pending death of a relative, right? And they're just upset. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. And then we also had another question that was good on, is cognitive dissonance just a novel concept? So, those that we introduce it to, they're aroused a little bit more just because it's new, whereas fraud, they hear about just about every, firm training that they attend.
It could be that. You're actually really, whoever said that has a really shrewd point. We can't, our design cannot differentiate between, we could have another novel, non-threatening ask. So at the theory level, you're looking for some other thing that's correlated with the possibility of fraud that is not as threatening or aversive to the auditors. And we just came up with cognitive dissonance. We don't think it's necessarily the only thing, and our paper should point that out. So other research could look at, other tools, similar new tools that are not going to be viewed in this reactive way by the auditors. And the whole thing with fraud is just that you're asked to do this all the time. And again, it's just an unpleasant thing to think about. So I would have to think about other things that Devin and Justin and Sebastian and I can list as promising interventions. It could be that just getting, I'm thinking out loud here, but some of the mindset stuff that is in the literature already could be also very helpful here. Just getting auditors into more of a deliberative mindset as opposed to this real implemental mindset. So there are other things for sure. Continuing a little bit for the sake of time, I wanted to put up just a couple of the multivariate results and just remark on some of them. And I'll go to the model. So we have two models of risk assessment and two models of risk addressment, if you will, addressing risk. And what we have here is a couple of things worth noting, is that, first of all, the control participants are assessing risk to be higher. And that's true. And they're more responsive. They're saying we need to change the audit plan. So here's a real practical takeaway that is not really central to our hypothesis. This could account for one reason why a regulator, if they send an inspector in to look at the audit, or that a firm's internal inspector comes and looks at the audit, why they think or challenge the engagement team. It's just that they come at this much more willing to assess risk to be higher and addressing risk to be higher. And this is something worth noting because it could be, if you go back to the more benign possibility here, it could be that the engagement team has already taken into account, has already impounded all of these earnings calls, risk factors. We're not sure that they're messing up here, but this could lead to a lot of inspection findings against the audit firm. This is a very similar model, but it actually controls for pre-call risk. And what you find is that the control participant positive coefficient goes away once you control for their pre-call risk assessments. So part of this engagement partner control effect here, control partner effect, is really their pre-call risk assessments in disguise. But what stays intact is this willingness to respond to these fraud cues. What we're really most interested in here from a hypothesis testing perspective, though, is these are our random manipulations, fraud prompt. So when the fraud prompt is present, the assessed risk goes up, and that is the case both when we include all of these archival controls, like some of the standard ones, percent change in sales is statistically significant. changing in property, plant, and equipment is negatively associated with higher risk and liabilities as well. But what I wanted to point out here is that the cognitive dissonance prompt, what you want to do, this is the coherence argument right here. The presence of the fraud prompt interact with their assessed risk to influence what they say we need to do in engagement. And these are borderline statistically significant. We're being ultra conservative here. These are the t-tests in parentheses. This really all merits one-tailed predictions very clearly from a theory perspective. For something like a 1 point, this is probably will be statistically significant. But what happens is that the cognitive dissonance prompt does this too, and it's more significant. The kicker here is that the advantage gained by the cognitive dissonance prompt goes away in its entirety when the fraud prompt is also there. So you see this evidence in other words, this multivariate model makes this univariate result. I mean, the univariate result still stays after controlling for these other factors. And we also learn that we have this very interesting finding of control participants being more concerned about risk assessment and risk addressment. So the next steps, there are a bunch of archival and dependent variables that we can look at, such as what did the audit firms actually do on these engagements after increasing the risk, at least after listening to the earnings call. For example, if let's say 4 out of the 5 partners who were on that engagement all think that the risk went up, not partners, but engagement team members, maybe the partner and a manager and a senior, what happens to the real audit work that they did? Does it go up? And they also want to sort the auditees into predictive fraud versus predictive non-fraud firms using available proxies, such as textual and perhaps voice analysis of the earnings call language itself, kind of what we've seen. But also, there have been a number of restatements. And I think, I'm not sure of how many restatements there are in the sample. Of course, not all restatements are indicators of fraud. We fully realize that. But I think there's in the neighborhood of, it's not that different than 20% of the auditees that we have. So that's what we want to do next. I'm very thankful for the chance to have presented today. I didn't leave very much time for questions, but I'm happy to stay on and answer questions. I don't have anything I need to be at for another, easily 15 minutes, but I want to respect your time too, and just thank you all for listening and for the very helpful chat discussions.
So thank you, Mark. I'm simply afraid that by what I say and how I say it, you can see my honesty, because you're obviously an expert in cognitive dissonance, so you can see through me, so to say. And so you made tremendous progress on this research, and I just want to, and I'm wary of time as well, but I just want to, I think this is a very interesting question from Anna here on the chat. Could the possible explanation of the results that you identify that more senior people are more willing to revise their audit plan, which was one of the polls, partly because of the fact that older people detect cognitive dissonance better?
Yeah, and a fabulous point. And I think that really is something we need to point out. And that's what the literature, there's not a lot of literature on this, but that is the finding in the psychology literature. So that makes the fact that for partners, but not for other participants, when you pair the cognitive dissonance prompt with the fraud prompt, it then goes away. So it can't be the case that, the older members of the engagement team probably don't see the cognitive dissonance as red. No, they actually see it better. And even though they see it better, their propensity to have higher coherence goes away between their assessments and addressment of risk goes away when the fraud prompt is coupled with the cognitive dissonance prompt. So Anna, that's right on. We'll definitely be able to use that observation. And also and Luke, your point that fraud might be more complex. Maybe this is kind of a combination with your point earlier with Luke. And thank you, Luke. It's good to see you here. It could be a simpler simpler thing as opposed to fraud. So you focus them on something that's much more manageable to look for, and they do that. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm just looking at the room if there are any other questions. And in the meantime, while people raise those, I think, Mark, the most interesting point you make is that, you know, auditors simply don't want their clients to commit fraud or can't believe it. And you would expect that when you prompt them for the fraud word, that would improve. But actually, you find the opposite,
Right.
that they make, you know, are more aversive.
Right.
And I think this is really an interesting finding that in practice we shouldn't instruct or coach our junior audit staff or senior audit staff to look for fraud and use the fraud word, but describe, you know, what they should be looking for. And, you know, that's really an interesting finding.
Well, I think, you know, you can't get too, have to be very careful about this, but it has our team wondering whether the fraud brainstorming session that we sometimes call it, it may end up doing no good at all or more harm than good because of this reaction.
Yes. So there was this question, you know, is this trainable? You know,
That's a
you know,
great. Yeah,
do you have any insights on that?
We have thought about and need to look into whether it's cognitive dissonance or other possible interventions. Cognitive dissonance seems very nice to think about, or very convenient to think about, because it's not unusual to think about cognitive dissonance. And it's, and maybe the term is too fancy, but just negative emotion. Just watch for.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that is something we can pursue, and maybe we can look at trying to help train and help educate people to find cognitive dissonance. That's a whole related research question.
And I think I'm sure, you know, I oversimplify, because it is not so simple as in the TV series that you look for people when they look to their left corner in their eyes or the right corner in their eyes, you can see deceit. But I guess it would help at least practitioners to have some cues. You know, what are cues of these cognitive dissonance? So I'm sure you will spend some words on that in your working paper and practice.
Sure,
notes.
For sure.
So one question you had yourself, Mark, at the start is, what can academics do to help the profession in its ability to detect fraud? So I just want to repeat that question to the audience. You know, if there are any questions in practice that you may have that you expect Mark and his team to be able to answer or help you answer, just let us know or let Mark know. That would help, you know, the academic research as well, right, Mark?
Absolutely, and we have so much data that just one advantage of sharing our interim work with you is that hopefully you'll come up with some ideas, and then we might even with the data we already have, be able to look at it in a way that we had not thought of, and that's would be invaluable. And it could also help us with future studies. But you know, keep in mind we have a lot of experimental data and a lot of archival data related to the audits. So we welcome any suggestions along these lines.
Great.
Thank you so much for these interviews and these links, and great. And I appreciate everyone staying on a little longer. And I understand, of course, why other people have to take off. It's time. I was going to say to go meet some friends at a bar, but it's not. You can't do that right now.
Oh, that's a pity indeed. So let's close up. No other questions from the audience at this stage, but you know, please feel free to email Mark or Devin or Sebastian or Jessen or us at FAR. I also want to draw your attention to the FAR website, where you can find previous work of Mark and his team on this topic, amongst others based on the 2019 conference of last year. I also want to let you know that we will be writing a short summary, executive summary of what we've learned, so you can share that within your research or within the firms that you work with. So with that, the only thing left is here to again thank Mark and his team great masterclass. I learned a lot. Thank you for being here, and good luck on your research. And for those, well, it's nearing Christmas, right? So
Yes,
maybe we can say Happy Christmas already. But
that's right.
take care and stay safe. Thank you very much. Hope to see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.